All right, so we should start. Welcome to the second series of the GBV Indaba. My name is Stella Musungu. I'm the Student Capacity Building Specialist, the Office for Inclusivity and Change. And I have the pleasure to participate at this Indaba, which is hosted in collaboration with Unsettling Knowledge Production Project. And the academic lead for today is Prof. Loretta Bunzaya, who is chair and program director for this session. Prof, thank you so much for hosting us and taking the lead on this project. I'd like to share with you a message from the BBC. Oh, see.
As Chancellor for Transformation, Student Affairs and Social Responsiveness, the University of Cape Town's 2023 Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Indaba was curated with multi-vocality and interdisciplinarity in mind. This is so that we hear from various voices that never find expression in one space, drawing from multiple disciplines to interrogate our current practices. We will explore the multifaceted aspects of response and prevention, but also learn from activists and organizations with long-standing formalized programs. Beyond these institutional programs, we will consider alternative community-based responses of prevention, education, survivor support, and administrative justice. Throughout the whole of August, the faculties of humanities, engineering and the built environment and law, as well as residences, will be hosting dialogues each week centering on topics that challenge us as a university. Using the UCT Sexual Misconduct 2022 report as a basis, the university community, students, and partnering practitioners will aim to deepen our learning so that we move beyond our comfort zones. Our first session, hosted by the School of Education and led by Dr. Leanne Naidu, responds to the question about whether restorative justice programs can really change behavior. A week later, the Department of Psychology's Unsettling Knowledge Production Project, led by Professor Loretta Bunzaya, considers discourses on sexual and gender-based violence. Led by the Engineering and Built Environment faculty psychologist, Dr. Nazima Ahmed, we will use the third session to interrogate whether counseling practices for survivors can enable agency when the academic program forces them to prioritize learning whilst managing their own post-traumatic stress. With Daniel Munene, we ask cisgendered men to become owners of change amongst their male-identifying communities in the fourth session. This will be hosted in one of our male residences together with students from the Office for Inclusivity and Change's Becoming Men program, which brings together cisgender male students who are seeking answers about how to become better at reducing the culture that they believe drives gender-based violence. Our last session is on the final week of the UCT Gender-Based Violence Indaba. Focused on administrative justice, it grapples with the complexity of national legislation applied within the university sector to uphold the rights of all. Professor Jamila Omar will lead this session. The work, of course, does not end here. Our next focus will be to collate information from these seminars to review, workshop, and test proposed new ways of responding to and preventing sexual and gender-based violence. Ultimately, these seminars serve as a reminder, once again, to take both individual and collective responsibility and act. Whether it is on a personal level, within our families, or through broader community engagement, we each have a role to play in combating sexual and gender-based violence. I encourage each and every one of you to approach these seminars with an inquiring mind and empathy. Let us listen to the stories and insights shared, and let them ignite a fire within us to strive for a safer, more equitable society. I extend my gratitude to all the participants and organizers and the Office for Inclusivity and Change under the leadership of Dr. Cyan Alves, who have worked hard to make this event possible. Together, we can become the catalysts for change and make UCT a place where no individual lives in fear of sexual and gender-based violence. Thank you, and I hope you will join me in this remarkable transformative journey.
Okay, before I invite Professor to lead us into today's session, I'd like to edify her. Professor Floretta Bonzaya is a professor at UCT with more than 17 years of experience in the field of psychology and a co-director of the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychology in Africa. Professor is noted for some of her work in feminist, gender and sexuality and gender-based violence. Professor received the South African Women in Science Award in 2010 and the UCT Advancing Women Award in 2019. Professor, you're welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Stella. Good afternoon, everybody. We look forward to this dialogue engagement with you today. I want to thank the Office for Inclusivity and Change for the collaboration and for inviting us to collaborate on Indaba. By we, I mean the Unsettling Knowledge Production on Gendered and Sexual Violence project, which is housed in the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychology in the Department of Psychology. We have some of our members in the group. And just to say very briefly to talk about the Unsettling Knowledge Production project, we are in our 5th year, and the rationale for the project was really to think about the extent to which gender-based violence, gendered and sexual violence continues, despite all of the activism, despite all of the research, more than decades of research and activism, but we still see the extent of gendered and sexual violence that we do in our context. And so that was our starting point for the project, to begin to ask, what can we as academic researchers do differently in terms of how we engage questions of violence, of gendered and sexual violence? And so on the project, we've worked with a range of topics, from exploring women's experiences of victimization, of programs, working with men, questions of perpetration, and we've also engaged with a whole range of organizations on the project. So it really is to kind of find ways for academic research itself to be a kind of activism against gender and sexual violence. And it is with that context that we come to the conversation today around discourses of sexual and gendered violence. And we have 4 speakers. I'm going to, in advance, thank our speakers. I'll introduce each of our speakers before they go, but to set some context for our conversation around why we thought it was important to actually talk about the language that we use and the discourses around violence and what implications that has for how we understand gender-based violence. So media and other discourse on gender-based violence has been massively underrated, we think, for the extent to which it enables the possibilities of either sanctioning or ending gendered and sexual violence against women and other marginalized bodies. The ways in which perpetrators and or victims or survivors of sexual and other forms of gendered violence are positioned in everyday talk has massive implications for the ways in which they are seen and for the ways in which they see themselves. It has implications for the support that they are able to receive and for who is seen to be responsible or who is blamed for the violence, as well as for the sense of safety, care, concern, and justice that survivors experience. So in this endeavor, we wish to create an engagement around language and discourse as it concerns gendered and sexual violence on public platforms such as the media and institutional communication platforms, as well as a range of other content. South African media discourse on gender-based violence has illustrated some clear patterns that both draw on and shape public discourse on violence. These include ideas that women and other marginalized bodies are responsible for their own victimization that their lead lives consumed by risk, that intimate partner violence is and should be a private issue, and that gender-based violence is only a problem for poor and Black people and communities. So these are some of the discourses that are already emerging in the field. Research, especially now in the Global South, has also begun to focus on the coloniality of discourses around gender and violence, illustrating the ways in which media discourse specifically upholds racist and sexist colonial legacies that include victim blaming, positioning different forms of sympathy for differently racialized victims, and marking the spaces occupied by Black bodies as inherently violent, marking particularly bodies as disposable, and ensuring that Black and Indigenous women's bodies and suffering are hypervisible. A common theme that emerges from recent literature also is that GBV is othered. It's considered to be out of the norm in particular places, and this tends to reinforce ideas about it being a problem only out there associated with particularly with poor and Black communities, which means that we let ourselves off the hook in terms of thinking about where violence is located. This theme also appears in institutional discourses and communications around sexual violence, where institutions construct themselves as separate from the communities in which rape happens, and where rape, for example, is painted as an anomaly, obscuring its systematic prevalence. These common discourses across platforms have very real implications for women, survivors, and families of victims and perpetrators. The stories that circulate in popular culture have implications for how we see and how we understand violence. It builds the myths by which we evaluate violence and entrenches our values around this violence. In this endeavor, we explore these issues while beginning to look towards more critical engagement with how we talk about and how we understand gender-based violence. So I want to welcome all our speakers today. Just in terms of the format of our conversation, I'll introduce each speaker. I've asked each speaker to speak for approximately 15 minutes. And then we'll have a few minutes just for questions, engagement around that specific speaker's presentation. After which, once everyone has spoken, we also have some time for general conversation and engagement. So up first, we have Kajal Kaur. You want to know your presentation? And I'll introduce you. Want to do that? So Kajal is a PhD candidate here in the Department of Psychology, and she is a project coordinator on the project Unsettling Knowledge Production on Gendered and Sexual Violence. Kajal's research centers around gender-based violence, discourse, decolonial feminism, and masculinity. And Kajal will be speaking around discursive constructions of gender-based violence, a reflection on the big picture. Over to you, Kajal. PowerPoint will need to feed. Is it in the house? Okay, sure.
Here we go. Okay, So it's my words. Okay. So today I'm going to be speaking to you generally about two studies, and I'm kind of drawing comparisons between them. The first study was one that was done on UCT's communications regarding rape in 2016. And the second study is one on media discourses on gender-based violence in COVID-19. And I'm going to be pulling from both. Obviously, the COVID-19 context is quite different to 2016 UCT. But interestingly enough, there are still a lot of parallels. So we're going to see that come through. Some of the things I think Prof already outlined in this conversation, but some of the things to keep in mind when thinking about what I'm trying to get at here is how language resists, reinscribes, how it engages issues of coloniality, how it engages issues of patriarchy, hegemony, and what it represents, constructs, and positions. And that's kind of what I'm trying to talk about when I go through these quotes and themes. So the first two discourses from each study, the first discourse is rape as exceptional, and that came from UCT. And the second discourse is gender-based violence constructed as a pandemic, which came from the media. Rape is exceptional was this discourse that painted rape as shocking. You can see in the quote, rape is unacceptable and criminal no matter where it happens or to whom it harms. But it is particularly shocking that it has occurred in what should be a place of safety, a student's room at a UCT residence. So we can see here that the UCT residence is constructed as a place that shouldn't be invaded by gender-based violence, and it's particularly shocking when it does. Yet we know that international research indicates that gender-based violence actually happens incredibly frequently at university and in residences. So it's not shocking. It's horrible, but it's not shocking. There were a lot of examples of rape being positioned as something that doesn't happen at UCT. And it's constructed as really disturbing when it happens here, something about it happening here. So is it less disturbing when it happens somewhere else? This is part of the thing, the tension that's coming up. So thinking about that, we've got to think about when, and this is coming from communications from UCT to students. So this quote came from a communication from UCT to students about a rape that had happened. So in that context, we've got to think about how can we communicate about rape in a way that does indicate disgust and distaste, but that acknowledges the systemic and prevalent nature of gender-based violence, so as not to alienate people who are experiencing it. How do we also acknowledge, in painting gender-based violence as exceptional, we are othering it, right? We're saying it's something that never touches us, and that's what makes it shocking when it does. So how do we engage gender-based violence in a way that acknowledges our enmeshment with it, while simultaneously holding our disgust and distaste for it? A similar discourse was the way in which gender-based violence was painted as a pandemic during the COVID-19 period. I'm sure you all remember gender-based violence being named a femicide being named a pandemic alongside COVID-19. And in a lot of ways, this was constructive because it allowed gender-based violence to remain newsworthy at a time where COVID-19 could have taken over the way that we were talking about news. So it was useful. But in borrowing that legitimacy from the pandemic, it also constructed gender-based violence as something that was located in time, the same way in which the pandemic is located in time, right? It placed a sort of expiry date on the relevance of gender-based violence in that. It presented it as something that was just as shocking and out of the norm as the pandemic itself, and didn't pay attention to the historical kind of long fingers the gender-based violence up and with a circumstance of lockdown, right? Rather than they go on in a long and one to these circumstances. Again, how do you prioritize violence arts with minimum strength, shocking and basis and highly historically located. The two doses are that of responsibility, which came from these communications, normalizing survivors, which came from the this is a very standard example of victim response. In this quote, you know, don't walk alone, don't walk at night, those kinds of things. And it's true, you know, in a group, we actually if the gender benefit is of a very particular type, strange, danger, and that's but we all isn't actually that. It is a lot more vulnerable in our homes as we are on the streets in groups, we are alone at the daytime. It's not useful. What particularly for legal and it's the grounding for future victim blame. This is the preliminary question wherein what we so you had to choose what time is it that you alone or the how to support resistance violence against women without resort to policing women. Victims out in and the women. And what ways we exist in final two discourses are silencing the patriarchy, which came from UCT, handling manage from the media. So in silencing the patriarchy, this is kind of an example conversation with you. Survivors should feel less afraid and more supported and able to tell their stories, seek action against perpetrators, and reach for help and support from stop and so these communications, there was no engagement discussion about kind of measures. Nothing. And in that side, who feels safe and who feels unsafe? We are here is about the victim. Here about the victim feels safe to come out against perpetrators. Who feels a woman, right? Woman in a so in violence in page perpetration anything to do with that's the equation protected. That's means to be problematic. Now it's important to say that this analysis happening when stuff that's happening in 20 versus the other analysis on stuff that was happening in 16. So you see in the yes, in terms of engaging, in terms of there is a conversation. There is about men. Is a conversation about this. Look, this first one. Okay. So aimed at this is about a program that's seeking mentorship and assistance in becoming better men and to provide victims of abuse with help. This WhatsApp line gives victims of abuse it also puts men who are struggling in touch with a mentor, someone to talk to, so they can start on the journey to being champion men. I just find it so interesting that being a man who isn't violent toward women is constructed as a champion, right? And being violent toward women is constructed as struggling to be a champion. It's a very particular way of engaging men and masculinity. This was pretty prevalent, but there were instances of this kind of second quote where we see it is a problem of men and their attitudes toward women. No amount of gender, religious, and cultural apologia can mask this. So that is an example of the resistant discourse that's coming out in the media. And the media is a diverse group of voices. And so we do see the struggle between a very fearful engagement with men that is very protective of masculinity and very gentle and what I've called coddling toward men. And then this much more clear cut, sorry, this is an issue with masculinity. There are things that need to be addressed here. So we can learn from this. So the questions we have from this is, how do we engage men when reporting and communicating about gender-based violence? So what does that look like? How do we foster a society in which perpetrators of gender-based violence feel unsafe? And in what ways can we unapologetically expose the role of men and masculinity and potentially coloniality in gender-based violence? Some of the final thoughts I have is, look at how many parallels there are. As an institution, we cannot separate ourselves from the broader picture, where these discourses, we're not separate. And yet UCT likes to see itself as separate, but we really aren't. UCT and the media has unequivocally positioned themselves against gender-based violence, but they don't have that same clear unequivocal againstness when it comes to perpetrators and patriarchy, which is interesting. I think there is a need for future research that helps us understand some of the factors that go into these kinds of communications. We've heard things like law and other things that can impact the way institutions communicate with its students and the way the media writes about things like gender-based violence. And I think it's important for us to have more clarity on those things and how they interact with feminist aims.
Thank you, Nigel. So we have a few minutes for questions, engagement with Kajal. Not sure if any.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I have 2 points. So there's one part where, and I hate this ideology where UCT is a utopic bubble. Like you said, it really separates itself. do you think that is aligned with staying the coloniality within the university alongside its historic privilege within society as well?
Yes.
And the second one, I guess this is also like very sensitive because a lot of institutions, separate organizations within UCT are very focused on victim first. And one of the points that I did see within your presentation was that if we're then going to position the victim as just a victim, are we not like disabling that idea of the victim being first and being the person that is, looked after, or should we position the victim as human first with ideas, opinions, and a way for that bring power to them without also positioning them as weak within those communication tools?
So, I mean, coming from the perspective of thinking about the language and discourse, I think one of the conversations that's kind of close to what you're talking about is survivor versus victim. And I think it's important that we're explicit in our engagement with those terms because survivors are both victims and survivors. And I think we can use both terms in interesting ways, but I think what you're saying is it's important to up-level the survivor status of women who experience gender-based violence. And I think that's important too. And I think it comes also to this question of where the focus is. We've got this hyper focus on the victimization of women and no focus on the perpetration. I think even in just shifting that focus, a lot will be done to shift the way in which we see women and their status as victims and survivors. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you, Platy. Just maybe time for one more question. Online?
No, there's no questions online.
Okay. Okay, then thank you, Kajal. We'll move to the next speaker. And as I said, we do have time for engagement afterwards, but actually we do have another question. Thank you.
Question to say, but you're really doing great work, and I believe that there is a need for such research to be conducted because given the high prevalence of IPV, GBV during COVID-19, there is a need for policies to protect those survivors and victims, and we cannot reach I feel like there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and not only on an institutional level, but outside. And I think this also calls for multidisciplinarity.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Kajal. Let's invite our next speaker, Paula Bernardo. Paula started in media when she was 14 years old, making a traveling show for the SABC. She spent time in the community media space, joining Bush Radio's youth training program, and hosted 2 shows at UCT Radio during her undergraduate studies. Just before graduating, she took up a position at Prime Media Broadcasting, Cape Talk, and later for Lead SA. She then spent time at Africa's first newswire service, the African News Agency, as Cape Town correspondent before joining independent media as group social media manager. Paula then made a move from news media to communications, joining UCT's research office before dipping her toes into the civil society space with Reclaim the City and Difono Kwazi. She later returned to UCT, joining the communication and marketing department, and is now the communication and engagement manager for the DSI NORAD Centre of Excellence in Food Security, co-hosted by the University of the Western Cape and Pretoria. Paula is completing a master's degree in political communication at UCT, and as you have just heard, comes with a wealth of experience in communication. So we look forward to hearing from Paula on her presentation on comms, crimes and courts, experiences of communicating about and reporting on SGB.
So firstly, sorry, my voice is, I'm sorry, coming from a chest infection. And then I've asked Daniela to just join me because I don't want to sit here at the front. Else wants to join, please do. I shouldn't put disclaimers in front of what I'm going to say and in front of my book, but I will be upfront about the fact that I find academic spaces, even as a university communicator, intimidating. And I will also, my language won't necessarily be the language that you are used to hearing, so please bear with me. And if I get it wrong, terms and concepts, I'm happy for you to enlighten me. Okay, and then last apologies that I am going to be reading quite a bit off my phone. Okay, so I think I need to start by saying that this is about my experience as a journalist, as a content producer, and I will explain the difference, and then as a communications practitioner in the university space. So some of it also draws on some research that I've conducted earlier on in my master's degree. But to be very clear, I'm in no way a researcher. Okay, so like Prof said, I cut my teeth in media when I was about 13, 14 years old with a children's studying program on SABC3. And so that was media. I only entered news in my early 20s, co-creating features for Eyewitness News, and then eventually joining the African News Agency, where I spent a fair amount of time in courts covering crime, including sexual and gender-based violence. So I think it's very important for us to make that difference from the start. I personally, and a lot of my former colleagues from the fraternity and the people we were trained by, do not see news and media as the same thing. And I think often in general discussion, it's grouped as one homogenous group. So with media, you talk about content creation. You're talking about going viral, likes, engagement, evergreen content. You may be bound by something like the press code, and you may be governed or a member of something like the South African National Editors Forum through your employer, but there's a lot more freedom to create as a content producer, and many more ways for you to tell a story. Media is also where I want us to place things like influencers, podcasters, social media. And even many of the opinion writers who are commissioned to write pieces because of their popularity and not necessarily because they are trained as journalists. News, on the other hand, is current affairs, it's current events, and it's reporting on this in the public's interest. It's about ethical and unethical conduct being clear. You have your press code, you have SANEF, you have the Ombuds Office, you have the honor and the responsibility that comes with being a member of the fourth estate. You have a duty to inform and at all times to report accurately. And we can debate whether this is a reasonable expectation, but the expectation is there that journalists do so without bias and without inserting themselves. Okay, and I think it's really important to make that difference because conversations about media very often assume that everyone has the same mandate, that everyone has the same responsibility, everyone has the same training, the same agenda, the same freedoms and the same restrictions, which is not the case and was certainly not the case during my time in news. Then there is university communications and marketing officers. From my experience, there are equal parts trained journalists and then just people who are really talented in content production. And that's writing, marketing, branding, making videos. But here we must be very clear that communications officers, essentially in every industry, you are not bound by something like the press code. You might use it as a guide, but you're not bound by it. Your responsibility is not to report in the public's interest. Your responsibility is to the brand or the institution and protecting that brand and that institution. And we can get into what that means, because even in one communications office that I'm working in or had worked in, there are differences of opinion of what protecting a brand and protecting the institution looks like. So you're communicating on behalf of the institution or the brand, and so everything you do, everything you produce is in that brand's interest. Okay, and so I want us to be clear about who we're discussing when we say the media, because if we can't clarify the rule, then our questions, our requests, our demands lose effect. Okay. So yeah, and then I just quickly want to explain that there are also various tiers of media. So when I had started when I was 14 years old, that is for the public broadcaster. When I had moved on to community radio, community media is a tier on its own. Where I spent most of my time in media was in private, that is a third tier. So those are the 3 tiers, really across the world. That's how we explain them. And they all have very particular mandates. Here in South Africa, very strongly, the public broadcaster and the community media have a very strong public interest and development agenda. That is their mandate. And so in terms of this conversation, I think where energy should go is to those 2 tiers. And then in terms of private, yeah, there are things, I mean, where I've worked, my experience, we do honor the press code. There is usually respect for the press code, for SANEF, which is our governing body for the Ombuds Office. A particular media house has opted out of these governing measures. That's perhaps also something to talk about. But profit making at the end of the day is privateer's main agenda. Okay, so my first job post-graduation, and most of my time, like I said, was spent in private media, and that was at Prime Media Broadcasting. So you are probably more familiar with the radio stations that it owns, Cape Talk, KFM, iFal, 702. Okay, and most of my work was the Cape Talk before moving on to media. And it's where I worked on my first big project focused on sexual and gender-based violence. I don't know the ages in the room, so I don't know how far back your memory would go with this, but this project was focused on Aline Boyson. So I see some heads nodding. I think if you are interested in how media communicates in terms of sexual and gender-based violence, I think that's a good case study to look at. And the project that we had worked on was, I think the overarching campaign name was #StopRape. Okay. And so what I recall now having to think about this for the Indaba was that there was backlash, specifically from academia, about one, the title of the campaign, #StopRape, that a campaign even existed, that a private media organization was running this campaign, that something, so we had a beat playing every 4 minutes. All ads were cut for 24 hours. No ads. This isn't a profit-making company. All ads were cut, and every 4 minutes that beat would go off, regardless of who's talking, what's happening. And that was to symbolize that at that point, in every 4 minutes, a South African woman is raped. I think that stat is now down to every 3 minutes. Last I checked. So the criticism was also that it was triggering, although the language wouldn't have been triggering then, I don't think. I think that's just kind of coming into our discourse now. Yeah, and so those were kind of the critiques leveled at Prime Media and at this campaign. And so what I should have also started with in the beginning is that thinking about all of this has left me with a lot of questions that maybe the rest of you can all give input into. But one of my questions in response to that criticism is, if Prime Media didn't do this, then who? And if we didn't do it in this way, then how? Okay, and as part of my job for this project, I sat for hours and hours scripting and packaging the audio from the day, listening to people across our many divides, many differences, open up, and many for the first time, about their own experience of sexual and gender-based violence. I'll never forget an 80-year-old woman who called into John Macon's show, and at 80 odd years old, for the first time, revealed that she too had been raped. And there were a lot of these stories. There were a lot of men who participated, which was something new for me. Men revealing that they too had been sexually assaulted, and then opening the door for other men to be able to say the same thing. Anonymity was respected, and I believe the space was held. And so, yes, we can dissect a lot about that particular campaign, about the many campaigns that have followed, about coverage, but we mustn't forget that oftentimes, and certainly in the instance of StopRape, that it provided a space for many, many people across the 4 radio stations, for people to feel safe enough to speak out, and for me, for the first time, to say it out loud. I wish I brought some water. So yeah, I'll just skip through a bit, but yes. So Did we do enough? I don't know. I would like you all to go and look at this project, and there's podcasts about it, there's audio clips, there should still be imagery and all the content we produce online. But yes, we could have done more. We can always do more. What could we have done better? A lot in hindsight, but again, I want to hear from those. And I'm happy that after the fact, after the endeavor, we can carry on this conversation. But then again, it's about, is it even the responsibility of a private media organization to be leading this conversation? Is it fair to critique them for doing so? Is it the responsibility of the public broadcaster? Really, it is their mandate to be carrying these conversations. Does it have the capacity? Does it have the skills? And does it have the time to be creative? So what I also recalled from the time, and I think in sharing my experiences, what I'm hoping to do is that when we talk about how language is used, how language is used, how stories are put together, I do want people to remember that the context, the rules that govern should govern journalism, and that there are people behind these stories, writing the stories with their own experiences. So what I recall from the time was having to listen to the audio and read emails of people sharing their own experiences of trauma and violation, the very worst kind of violation I believe anyone can experience. And having to sit alone for hours and hours, playing and replaying this. I remember taking brief moments to cry about it, and then immediately reminding myself, you know, you have a job to do. And at this stage, I was 21, 22 years old. That was me in a room in the safety of my studio. Outside of that, and for days before that, before the news of a new broke, and for years before that, there are journalists who have been covering this. So they've spent numerous years on numerous cases, similar cases, all of them needing to sit with victims' families, all of them needing to hold space for victims' families, hold space for themselves, report on the story without inserting themselves in the story. They cannot cry in front of families. That makes you unprofessional as a journalist. And then certainly you have now inserted yourself in the story, so you cannot feel. And these are people who are doing it day in and day out, having to report about this. And I think that's a hell of a ask to ask anyone. But it's what is expected of journalists, and certainly the place when I was in news media. And so I'm going to bounce around a bit. But another thing that's very important to highlight in terms of news media, in terms of journalists, is that debriefing, counseling is not a thing. You would be very lucky to have an editor or station manager or someone, a senior producer, who has the time to debrief and counsel and who has the skills to do so. Most of those who are in these senior management positions, they went through exactly the same. And so it's kind of just, you got to bear it, like suck it up, bear it. And the reality is, or the likelihood is that most journalists wouldn't access these services anyway. Because much like the police, who also don't access or have readily available access to debriefing, is that we have this expectation, or the industry has the expectation, that you should just be able to deal with it. This is part of the job. You write about it, you report on it, you separate yourself from the story, and you get it done. Forget about it, move on to the next thing. So I think that's also important to remember. And then a lot of my time was spent in courts. So courts for journalists, a very easy place to find stories. In South Africa, we obviously have a hell of a lot of stories. In courts, I spent most of mine in the magistrates' courts, and a lot of our senior journalists in the High Court. And the treatment of cases obviously differ as well in the magistrates' court. I mean, it's one after the other. It's like a conveyor belt. And you're going to get a range of crimes. Mine in particular was sexual and gender-based violence, and then gang-related activities. And it's just thinking about it, and like, as a journalist, just having to forget that you are sitting, oftentimes, the media bench is right next to the perpetrator's bench. and there's nothing separating the two of you. You've just got to trust that if something happens, the police are going to step in. And you've just got to be able to report and take notes and live tweet at the same time, and possibly also file a story while in court with a rapist staring at you throughout the session. You've got to watch how you dress. You've got to watch how you engage with him. You've got to make sure you've got what the judge is saying, because often judges don't want proceedings to be recorded, even on the phone. And so you've got to keep that all together at the same time. But one of the things about courts for me is that's where I realized that it is unnatural what journalists do or are expected to do. I had been covering a case, a very high profile case, but it was in the magistrate's court, of a young girl who had been raped and murdered. And so we were in the magistrate's court, and the room that we were in is about 4 rows for, I don't know, audience. And then there's a gap, and then the perpetrator's standing. And the judge is quite far in the front. And I was sitting next to, there was 3 perpetrators, I was sitting next to their family. So journalists and their families all sitting together. The perpetrators right there. And we were having to, so at that time, I'm live tweeting, I'm writing, I'm taking notes. You also don't want the families to see what you're writing about. You don't want to offend them. You don't know who you're going to offend. And you are then listening to the perpetrators give their account of what has happened and going in detail about what has happened. And then the lawyers repeating what has happened, and then the judge repeating what has happened. And this is constantly, you've got to write, there's no emotion. And I remember leaving that day and leaving that case and getting into my car, having filed the story, having put out tweets, having heard exactly what has happened to this girl, a lot of which was not reported, because then we also have to make the decision, is it in the public's interest to say everything that has happened? And does it help the family for us to reveal everything that's happened? And this is not to say that every journalist and every newsroom makes the same decision, but I can say that the people that I worked with at the time, this was the thinking, is yes, in the public's interest and also for the protection of the public and families. But getting into my car, driving off and then revealing, realizing I feel nothing. That I heard all of this, that it was so graphic that these men were standing in front of me. It's now 5, 6. And I don't know what kind of impact it has on storytelling, on how you set the news agenda, on the language you use, and on the far more experienced and veteran journalists who are still in that space, who are still covering the stories. There's a lot of conversation around journalists and substance abuse. I don't know what the stats are on that, but there's also that entire world and reality to think about when we're talking about the responsibility of media, the language being used, the gender setting frame, and all of that. I don't know how much time I have left, but
if you maybe wrap up so we can give people an opportunity to think. And
so if you have any questions, obviously, but I'm going to quickly go into, so I worked at UCT's Communications and Marketing Department, that is Central Comms. I do feel like I need to explain that most students don't actually engage with Central Communications. But I was working at UCT during the time of, as I'm sure most of you will recall, or had engaged in the news around it, Nene's murder and rape. And so I worked through it. I had written stories, I produced videos, I had done coverage at the memorial site, at the post office, all of that. And then a year later, I then conducted my own research for my master's degree. And just some of the things, I'm not going to get into necessarily UCT's, what I had said or what I had found in my research about UCT. I think more broadly about higher education, what the research says in terms of crisis communications, because that's my lens. was that, so, and I think it's also interesting for the OIC to hear some of that, is that, so the research is saying, and this is really research in South Africa and higher education institutions, students prefer that universities handle their case due to a lack of trust in the criminal justice system. At the same time, security at higher education institutions is considered inadequate and leave women students vulnerable to SGBV. Proactive interventions emanating from the research includes making gender courses compulsory for all first-year students, organizing men's-only discussion forums created on gender issues, ensuring everyone is identified at the entrance to campus, which is always a discussion at UCT when these things happen. This is an open campus. Perhaps there needs to be a discussion about that, making people feel safer. All members of the campus community to wear ID cards. There's a few more that I can share later. In terms of communications, in times of crisis, the guidelines and the best practices and what to avoid is the responsibility of communicating during a sexual and gender-based violence crisis lies with university leadership, particularly that of the university president or vice chancellor in the case of UCT. Quality communication from the VC is paramount, particularly as community members turn to university leadership in times of crisis. The VC sets the stage for communication, the university's response, and the flow of information to the public. Some others, this was very important for me, which I don't think any university communications team has patted down, and that is that they must ensure that there is a ready and effective crisis communications team and that it is regularly trained. So that requires resources, and it does require that there is an understanding of crisis communications, crisis response. There needs to be that understanding as well. But that was very clear. Then just in terms of the way that things are communicated, there must be compassion, there must be proactive engagement with news media. The senior leadership must be available for interviews, and that all communication from the Vice Chancellor must be foregrounded in transparency, accountability, and ethical behavior, and work in this regard must precede and extend beyond the crisis. And then I think just lastly, we can get into the rest of it, but I had started by saying that at a university and in industry communications, your responsibility is to the brand and to the institution. Differs slightly in the crisis communication research, especially around higher education, and that there are ethical responsibilities tied to crisis response, and this includes prioritizing stakeholder safety and not the organization's reputation. I think I'll leave.
Okay, thank you. Broad context, which I think is really useful, but also especially around your experiences and, you know, kind of reflection on the media practitioner's experiences of what the context really is like. And we'll have some more engagement afterwards. I'm going to move on to the next speaker so that in case people need to leave, everyone will have a chance to speak and we can engage in a conversation after. I'm sure there will be questions for you as well. So thanks again. Next we have Bandile. Next we have Bandile Chat. Bandile is a final year student at UCT, pursuing a Bachelor of Social Science in Psychology and African Studies. And he's passionate about gender and feminist studies and taken many electives in this field of the course of a degree. This interest, coupled with a love for volunteering, is what motivated Bandile to join the Agents for Change education program at the end of last year. And she's found great fulfillment in her role as an ACE educator and has shown great success and confidence in the facilitation of their instructions. Bandile is going to be talking about GBV discourse and social media. Over to you.
Afternoon, everyone. Just waiting for the presentation to load. I'll get started.
Okay, so as Prof said, I'm going to be speaking about GBV and social media. And in speaking about discourse of gender-based sexual and gender-based violence in social media, I thought the best platform to speak on is Twitter because it's very notorious for facilitating discourse. That's kind of the point. And I believe in transparency, and I will be the first one to admit that in my research, if you can call it, to do this presentation, I became very overwhelmed at the sheer amount of examples of sexual and gender-based violence that you find on Twitter. And this was due not even to a particularly deep dive. It's literally just scrolling on my timeline, and all of this is just put in your face. And well, as disheartening as it may be to view, it's reflecting the reality. And the unfortunate reality for South Africans especially is that there's virtually no way to escape being faced with all these instances of gender-based violence because they're just that common. And these aren't stories happening to someone somewhere in some random realm of the world, especially in our context. As Carla had mentioned, a rape happens every 3 minutes. And now, of course, I'd like to preface my message by saying that women are not the only victims of these types of violence, and nor are men the only perpetrators of these types of violence. Abuse, domestic violence, sexual violence can be perpetrated by anyone and enacted upon anyone. But of course, in keeping in line with this fact, I also want to be honest about the reality and honest about the discourse facing it, and that women and children especially are framed as victims, and especially, but for my presentation, I don't want to refer to them as victims, rather survivors. And discourse within social media focuses on women as survivors. Now, like I said, while seeing all of this, seeing a child getting raped, you're seeing all these horrible instances can be disheartening. I don't want to paint social media as being completely negative in this space. Social media, and the nature of the platform, it's easy to share stories. Share stories is easy to spread awareness, and even assist in getting the public to help with cases such as missing person. People can share information, people can retweet, people can say what they've shared, what they've seen. And there are amazing organizations such as Women for Change, Safe Space RSA, I Hear You, Guanela South Africa, who do amazing work in their field and hold space for and protective spaces for survivors. And social media is also a good space. It's good for the space in the sense of online activism. The hashtag Am I Next campaign, the hashtag Me Too campaign, the releasing of the list as it's become known by UCT students is also all sorts of good work that social media can do in this space. But acknowledging the good, we have to also be realistic about the facts. And the fact is that social media exists as spectacle. When we think about social media, we think about favorite celebrities posting about their lavish lifestyles and seemingly perfect lives. And while thinking, we're all entitled to have an opinion on it. Oftentimes what we're seeing isn't real and it's made for entertainment. But the problem that arises in social media is that people that are real and citizens that are real are being put to the same standard of things that aren't real. And that happens amongst the celebrities, amongst all the celebrities seeing the influencers, the latest meme. You also have real stories of sexual and gender-based violence survivors sharing their personal accounts. And what happens now is that they are not immune from being put under the social media lens. And what results is a very particular type of discourse where stories now become sensationalized. In this particular example, this young girl was reported missing, but then reported as found, which is an amazing occurrence, a very rare occurrence, unfortunately. And you'd think people would be joyed, people would be merry, but I know it's not so much clear now. But the comments were riddled with, well, okay, now tell us the story. Or, okay, cool, she's found. What actually happened? Was she at her boyfriend? You can't leave us hanging. Someone said, you can't leave us hanging. We've been too involved now. And that is, obviously just insensitive blatantly and just downright re-traumatizing to the family of the victim themselves. And I think it's just a fun, way to depict it of have a very real and drastic incident. And it's like, okay, well, how can I frame this in a way to make it feel, palatable for social media? And what happens in these, like I said, is there are many negative implications for survivors to this type of discourse. Social media sensationalization of SGB leads to being a comparison between survivors' experiences. Those that are more shocking, violent, and gruesome take precedence, and the ones that are reported most often because of their ability to play into the sensationalization. No one wants to hear about some story that's just like little. You want all the big news. You want something that's going to feed you, something that's going to play into that shock factor, that's something that's going to keep you interested, keep you engaging, keep you tweeting, and all that stuff. But that's not necessarily the reality of every single scenario that happens. And also, we need to remember that these are not stories that exist. These are real life accounts and real life experiences of real people. And they tend to be traumatizing. No one wants to come out of being kidnapped. No one wants to come out of being raped and have to tell every single story because the people need to know. What people need to realize, especially in social media, is that the person and these experiences exist beyond the screen, and sensitivity needs to be applied to that. Following on the sensationalization of SGBV, survivors who are able to come forward and tell their stories are more often than not met with hostility and questioning rather than compassion and comfort. The common theme of social media is survivors expected to divulge every single detail. If they can't provide it, then do we really believe them? Do you have enough evidence? Did it really happen, or are you trying to ruin someone's life? As if they didn't have their lives ruined by such a traumatic experience. And I think what's really interesting, especially in social media, is that survivors are often painted as this fragile victim that experienced something so traumatic, but never afforded the care that a fragile victim should be afforded. Now, I mentioned earlier that social media makes a platform for online activism, and this can be good. But much like the survivors, there seems to be a trend of people forgetting that these issues, although their victims, exist beyond the screen. While everybody types their thoughts and prayers, few tend to reflect on what actually may need to happen from beyond that point. Another powerful tool which is often used in social media and which I believe works against survivors of SGBV is the use of the passive voice. Social media news outlets, whether it be normal influencers, your Musa Kawulas and myself will tweet, a woman has been raped, rather a man just raped a woman. There's intention behind using passive voice. Is it to make it a bit more palatable and easier to report? Potentially, but it also has implications for the survivors of these crimes. When you report something as being enacted onto someone instead of being enacted by someone, it takes that responsibility and accountability from the perpetrator and shifts it to the survivor. Now you are responsible for having your body violated. Why did your body exist to be violated? Rather than, well, how could you ever violate someone's body? Oftentimes, the survivor is either made responsible for provoking the perpetrator into committing GBV or for not making good enough decisions to ensure their safety, as if there's any way to grant total safety in South Africa in the first place. This way of speaking and reporting instances of SGBV perpetuates rape culture. Now, as I mentioned earlier, social media doesn't always have to be a negative space, and there's various NGOs and movements that occupy a positive space in this regard. But even the conversations where they are been facilitated in safe spaces often tend to be overpowered by negative voices. Unfortunately, online discourse seldom to be survival focused, and in some comments section of the organizations that I told you about, all these comments are from Women for Change, a very good based organization. People will post a story, and they are very neutral, can I say, that they say this will happen, this is the victim, they're very big on say her name, and that is great. But then you get people in the comments like this. Of the two instances that are reported here, the two instances of a child, the most recent one is a child, 4-year-old girl, was raped and killed, and the perpetrator was found not guilty, even there being like the evidence was not sufficient, but he confessed even. And second instance is a woman was shot dead on her walking home from work after she denied a man's advances. And the comments were, how do you rape a child? Even old women can't take it to you. An innocent child, come on, this is evil. Implying that, all women struggle with penetrative sex. And my question to them is it less evil if it's an older woman? Is it only evil because it's a child? And the second one is, surely when you rape, there will be DNA left, right? If it doesn't match with this, then kind of going to the victim blaming culture of why did you report it? How come there's no DNA? What's the evidence? And even things like rape kits are seen to be unsuccessful if you've taken a shower after you've experienced your traumatic events. And last one, which I think was quite heartbreaking on the woman who got shot, is this story seems incomplete, but RIP, I guess, which is just so terrible. And it reflects very much, this is I think the best ways of explaining the discourse of how social media treats survivors of SGBV. This is just about, for instance, of what happened to a survivor. Recently, a woman got spiked at a barn observatory and had to go to Woodstock. Firstly, the observatory police wouldn't help her and had to go to Woodstock to get that help, and was met with a lot of scrutiny, a lot of, why didn't you go get the CCT footage? As if, you know, me as a civilian, that's my job. And I think it's important to note that this discourse that social media facilitates doesn't stay on social media. It comes into these professional bodies. These are police officers, people supposed to enforce the law, people supposed to provide safety, saying these things to women, saying, what did you eat? Why did you accept a drink? Why did you do this? Why did you do that? And as if you can protect yourself from being violated. Rather, why they're asking, why did that person violate you in the first place? And moving on to this, I want to speak on how the perpetrator is positioned, a very, very, very different experience. And while the threat of being harmed by a stranger is completely real, in 2020, Stats SA reported that almost 50% of assaults were committed by those close to the survivor. Friends or acquaintances accounted for up to 22%. Spouses or partners made up to just over 15%, relatives, household members at 13%, whereas unknown persons accounted for 29%. Now, the dominant online discourse regarding perpetrators, especially one that prescribes safety tips, is don't walk around alone at night, be aware when you're in public, check under your car, just interact with any stranger. And the question for me that I pose is, what do you advise someone when the threat is literally in their home? The data is clear in suggesting that the biggest threat is oftentimes the one that's closest to you and the one that's seemingly the most harmless, because I feel like we all like to think that the ones close to us don't wish us any ill will. But there seems to be a gap between the facts and the discourse, because in instances of intimate partner violence, survivors are more often than not told that the matters of your household are private. But that's only not even true for Twitter comment sections, but has also been reported being said by police officers. Now, before I continue, of the most important things I would like to be noted is that SGBV is not a private issue and should not be treated as such. It affects us all and we'll have a part to play in combating it. And if there's a bit of wisdom I can offer for my 21 long years of life, is that there is no dealing in private with someone who is willing to abuse, harm, or assault you in any way. Help is always something that should be taken, and there's absolutely no shame in taking it. The online discourse surrounding perpetrators of SGBV is that there's some shady looking character hanging out beside the streets. You see, don't talk to that guy at the bar, he's creepy. But the reality of it doesn't necessarily affect so. CEOs, athletes, church leaders, politicians, loved ones, respected members of communities, all these people hold high positions in society, and all these people can also be perpetrators of SGBV. The current depictions and languages used to speak about perpetrators is not only harmful because it ultimately downplays the reality of the issue, but also has serious implications for survivors and the ways in which they are afforded care. Picture a scenario, a survivor is finally mustering up the courage to come forward with their story, and they are met with, I don't believe it is them, hey? I know them, they're a good person, they wouldn't do that. Or, he's really wealthy and attractive. I don't think you need to resort to that. Are you sure you're not doing it for the money? Or, man, your spouse is probably just stressed from a hectic day at work. They just lashed out at you once. You know he's a good man. And these are all very real responses that survivors get. And it has various implications ranging from the very real responses has gotten, and the implications can't be ignored. Lack of help from criminal justice resources, declined mental health, increased feelings of loneliness, increased likelihood to stay in such unsafe environments, and the potential to become victims again of another instance of SGBV are some of the implications that survivors face. And all of these can be linked to the language we use to speak about SGBV. Another issue that I think highlights the importance of language and meaning making is reflected through the lived realities of many, where instances of SGBV are not always overt and violent and gruesome. Some of them can take form more covertly. They can be coercion, online harassment, stealthing, financial abuse, even emotional and mental abuse that takes form, if someone says it in a calm and neutral tone, you might not think of it as bad as someone shouting at you and threatening to put you up against the wall. And to that, I wanted to be noted that It's important to understand this when reviewing online discourse surrounding perpetrators, because they are not any less of a perpetrator according to who they are, what they did, how they delivered. SGBV is SGBV. Perpetrator is a perpetrator. And no matter what the circumstances are over surrounding the incidents, they're the ones who'd be held responsible for what they did. Unfortunately, GBV focused discourse, which does have the potential to be an informative space to facilitate much needed conversation, has been co-opted by perpetrators of rape culture, sensationalization, inaccurate portrayal of the issue at large, followed by imprecise representations of various proponents of the issue. Due to social media being so widely used and available, it has become one of the biggest platforms in which discourse is facilitated in our current times, if not the biggest platform, if you may say, because not everyone exists in academic spaces like this to engage in things critically. There exists a need to change the narrative as well as the language used when speaking of GBV, its victims, as well as the perpetrators. This is due to the negative implications that current discourse has for GBV survivors. In understanding the importance of changing the narrative, the thinking of what discourse is, it's important to understand that discourse isn't just a conversation that exists as that. Discourse is a way of making meaning, sharing ideas, and sharing opinions. And most importantly, those opinions, those ideas, those attitudes inform actions. And those actions are what manifest as SGBV. While we celebrate this Women's Month and look how far we've come, I think it's important to never lose sight of how far we still need to go. To leave you with the parting message, it would be to please exercise caution and compassion most importantly, when you engage with another instance of SGBV on your timeline. Try and see the story beyond the screen and remember that exactly that it's not a story, it's someone's personal lived experience. Be mindful of the language you use when engaging with these issues, and always, and I cannot stress this enough, always believe survivors. Thank you.
Very interesting panel cross presentation. I think you have left us some maybe one question before we move on to the next presentation. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. It's actually not a question, and I wasn't going to say.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a comment. I think social media is such an interesting space, especially where we're going with all the large language model stuff that ChatGPT and interested. So I think going to the topic or the rationale that Prof spoke about in terms of thinking about, given that we've had all this research and all this activism, and we still find ourselves in an altered space, but still in the space of continuing SGBV. I'm just wondering what this means, that this online space has been, again, kind of the disproportionate language is negative in a way, and it's not helping the cause. And the fact that we're moving so quickly into this algorithms that people are going to be drawing on to make sense of the world, it really worries me in terms of where this will potentially take us when these voices are so strong, whether it's racism, sexism, all of these different things. So yeah, it's really important research, and it goes back to this point of what action needs to be taken before we get to this point of being overtaken by the next level of ChatGPT 4 and 5, and, and just perpetuating these types of narratives. That's really worrying.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think in answer to that, an attempt I've seen recently on Twitter especially is that now there's a thing called community notes. So if you post something, especially for things that are kind of like clickbait, there'll be at the bottom they say the community they say actually this may be like fake news. Maybe this source is from 2019, not from these current riots, or this person actually didn't do this or that, and people will link proper studies that are on the actual topic, but that again comes to it being community notes. It relies on the responsibility of other viewers who think that no, actually I have the responsibility as a person who's participating in the world to correct that. And then now I guess another challenge is who feels, especially like taking us out as academics, who feels that like righteous enough and radical enough to put forward these messages and be like, this is the truth. I think that's that's the new space to try to navigate.
Thanks, Ian. Okay, and last but definitely not least, up next we have Chiniki Wechoko, who's a published author, academic, and activist, predominantly focusing on gender studies, transformation, decolonization, and gender equality. She earned a Bachelor of Social Science, graduating in distinction in gender studies. at the University of Cape Town, currently pursuing an honours in gender transformation at University's Department of African Feminist Studies, with a research focus on masculinity and SGBV. Cindy Kiwa is currently a guest lecturer at IAS abroad, educating international students on gender and sexuality from a South African perspective. Outside of academia, she's a gender advisor and change educator with the Office for Inclusivity and Change, and has served on many UCT leadership structures. She's passionate about decolonization within the UCT president. And Finiki will be engaging us around a presentation on positioning the victim and perpetrator. Over to you.
Hey everyone in the room and everybody online. I am trying to load my presentation. It will be a presentation, but I want it to be a conversation. I hate stuffy rooms where only one person speaks. I like hearing rooms and ahs and yes. That's right. Okay. Going to time myself because I tend to speak a lot. Hi, everyone. So I'll be looking at positioning the victim and perpetrator of sexual and gender-based violence in media from a gendered decolonial perspective. I will preface by saying, do not cancel me. I always have my colleagues see the thing. I'm merely looking at things from my own perspective, and I think it is very important for me to position myself. So I am Simniki Wenigi Tadluku. My name is very much so Xhosa. I am a Xhosa woman from the Eastern Cape. That contextualizes my viewpoint of society. And also my experience within gender is from UCT's gender department. Okay, so let's start into gender stereotypes and how South African media is reinforcing gender stereotypes based on heteronormative ways of thinking. Because gender-based violence doesn't just start with a man or a woman, it starts with the construction of gender. Now, how does the media construct gender? Now, by the media, I mean everything on TV, everything in books, everything on social media. Apologies. Sort of everything that you see is media to me. So basically, how the stereotypes basically construct are ultimately colonial. What does colonial mean? Colonial means all of the systems that exist within society that basically propagate white supremacy, that propagate the people on top being the people that is the white ruling man, as we call it in academia. Now, these colonial structures are basically things that are very systemic. They have been there for years, and it's the little things in media and in everyday life that reinforce these heteronormative, very much so colonial structures. They position women or one gender, because I won't just say woman, one gender, and in all senses as weaker to the man, and masculinity as being powerful and seen to be powerful in all senses. Now, this, and by all senses, it means economically, physically, intellectually, and we only don't just see this in just media spaces, we see this in academia, any space where you can think of the system of coloniality exists. And it has a big, big, big proponent in how we see gender and how we see GBV. So let's start off with advertising. I know this is weird, but you probably see these everywhere. Okay. In this, one thing that I feel like luxury brands definitely highlight is definitely the woman being the point of sexualization, the over-sexualization of the woman and the strength that is within the man. And I'm only using heteronormative terms because of just the construction of these pictures are very much so heteronormative. So if we can see here, firstly, the woman is not even looking at us. She has no opinion, basically. She has no viewpoint of society, but the man is in a position of protection, of being a provider, of being strength in these pictures and is looking at us and is basically the pinnacle of this advert, basically. And if you see these and many other instances of advertising, this is how society sees men and women. Men as being the position of being the leaders in society and women being merely the seductive followers. And this plays a lot in how we basically see women in any type of media platform because well, this is how everybody sees each other. And this doesn't only limit itself to media, as it also comes back into reality. How do we see ourselves as women? How do we see ourselves as men? How do we see ourselves as non-binary people outside of the heteronormative structure? Going into how then South African men and masculinity in media is portrayed. Let's look at the award-winning popular movies and how they construct Black and colored men in media. We'll start with Tsotsi, okay? Tsotsi, I mean, we say the word every single day if there's crime somewhere. Tsotsi, if you think of GBV, there's this in academia, we call it the angry, aggravated Black man. And whenever someone thinks of a criminal in South Africa, the first point of action is Tsotsi. And if you have an award-winning, movie that says Tsotsi, and then it brings Black men into the state of being dangerous, of being aggravated, of being criminals, what does this say about Black men in society? How do we view Black men in society? Do we view Black men in society as these people who are always the perpetrators of violence, who are the source of criminality in society? Or should we change the way in which we see ourselves and we see Black men in society as well? And this is the same with colored men. I mean, this award-winning film, Four Corners, which is basically a depiction of colored men in gangs here in the Western Cape, is very much so based on a true story. But the story, what does the story tell about colored men in society? Do we have positive constructions of colored men in society where we could say, okay, men in society in South Africa are positive? And the question for me to everybody in this room is, do these images and do these movies propagate and help within how we shape how we see men in society, how we then see perpetrators in society, as it then shapes how the only perpetrator of violence, statistically even, is a Black or colored man or Indian man, and they're always criminals carrying guns and they're out to get you. As Bandile had highlighted, 20% of that violence is stranger danger violence, and yet all we see in the media about violence, criminality, and SGBV is from these instances. Now we have to also question, why are these shows winning awards? Are they winning awards because of the message that they're sending? Is it the talent in there? Is it the rawness, the exoticness, and rather also the propagation of coloniality and the constructions of Black maleness from a Biko stance within these media devices? Okay, I think I'm talking very, very fast. So the victims in media. Now, statistically, the victims in South Africa are positioned as women. It is recorded that women are the main victims in society. But are they the only victims within society? Now, the way in which the media positions women, especially that of Black women, by Black women I mean African Black women, colored women, Indian women, how are they positioned within media? Are they positioned within a point of weakness where they are powerless, where they are silenced consistently? What does this say about women in society? If you are positioned to be only silenced, when do you then have a voice? Who then gives you that voice? And I think within targeting media campaigns and how to help women, we also need to see how we position ourselves as individuals in society. If a woman is, like, for example, this campaign, WhatsApp brave, what does that mean? Like, be brave to stand up, be brave to have a voice, as if the act of violence towards that woman took away that voice that she has. That's the perception that we have on victims in society. We see that as weakness. And for example, one of these media campaigns and social media as well positions the woman in a very glee manner, especially when they die from these cases. It's a very like, she was a hero in society and you took that away from us. Why is it that we position women in that way? Why is it that we never position any other gender outside of the binary in that way? And outside of positioning women outside of a victim flowery way, why don't we just focus on what they brought into the community, how they died? Where is the perpetrator? Why do we focus on the fact that she just died and she contributed and that's the end of the story? Why are we focusing on who the perpetrator is? Who did the crime? Why did they do it? Who are they? We never see the faces of our perpetrators, but we always see the faces of the victims in media. And my following point is intimate violence of reality versus media. As Bandile mentioned, The reality is that about 1 in 3 women and about 1 in 4 men are report having experienced severe physical violence with an intimate partner in their lifetime. Yet in media, every time that we see rape, SGBV, GBV in a sense, it's never intimate. It's never in the context where it's the wife and the husband in a heteronormative sense, because apparently that does not happen. And it reinforces the myths of how sexual and gender-based violence exists in society. When victims of SGBV come forward and say, well, my husband raped me, my wife raped me, how is our reactions towards that? Is that believable? And the reinforcement of these ideas of how intimate violence can exist is what's really dangerous with how we view SGBV. I think how I can challenge everybody in this room is when I say GBV, what do you first think about? Do you think about a Black woman being raped? Do you think about correctional rape? Do you think about a husband being raped by his wife because they are entitled to their sexuality? Do you think about a boy being molested by a teacher who is femme or male? What do we think about when we talk about sexual violence? And I think degendering sexual gender-based violence is also part of how we can also eliminate and create better discussions around gender-based violence, how we can also bridge the gap between talking about women being only the victims and not having power, but also positioning them as survivors, as people who can do something, positioning men and holding men accountable as perpetrators, and also positioning them as the victims of violence. And from a gendered perspective as well, when do we stop seeing a boy child being innocent and being, a boy and a child to be an aggressive man in society that is just a perpetrator? Because clearly in academia, I will critique academia for positioning men specifically as perpetrators consistently. I think that from a gendered perspective, especially as someone who does gender, it is time for us to degender that stereotype and also position everyone in society as the perpetrator, as the victim, as someone who can be a survivor, a victim, and person that can actually enact and enable action to actually dismantle SGBV. Because if we always position and we tell the story from just one perspective, we're not doing enough. We're not telling enough stories, and we are missing the gap. It's not a debate. A desensitized viewer. So one of the problems that I do have with specifically like media in general is how it positions the story. It tells the story from a place where, for example, a 4-year-old sexually abused in school, 2 teachers how the algorithm identifies them. My thing is when you read the story within the newspaper, it always starts off as, for example, as Simiki was walking down in her very beautiful dress, going to the park on a normal Saturday, she was raped. It positions this daisy, unrealistic, and very much so dangerous perspective of how SGBV exists. It's though you're trying to sell us a story of how it happened rather than just saying what actually happened. Why does the story of the before, of who this person was, whether they were a daughter, whether they were a school child, why does that matter? Yes, intersectionality definitely and context definitely does matter. But how we position the victim and the survivor of SGBV is also very important. Why is it that we have to sell the reasons behind you have to care about the story matter? Shouldn't you just care because someone got raped? Shouldn't you just care if someone actually was molested? And does their gender matter as well? If we put out a 4-year-old woman, girl, child, man, woman, boy, does that matter? Is it rather the act of SGBV what we should be focusing on, or rather the label behind who is victimized? What is really important? Okay, so what does this do? It normalizes SGBV in our daily life without seeing acts of justice. And I think this is the most problematic thing that I have within media is that, yes, definitely, it is a representation of what society is, especially with the news and with, newspapers as well. They reflect what's happening in society. But we never have stories of perpetrators going to jail. We never have perpetrators of being found. We never have stories of how perpetrators became perpetrators. Were they in a gang? Okay. were they influenced by social constructions to actually rape someone? Yes, the motivations of rape should never be justified. I am not a victim blamer. I will never victim blame anybody. But the story behind every part of SGBV definitely matters, I believe, in my sense. What does this also do? It creates myths around SGBV and how it exists in society. When you have instances of just one person, one picture, and one story existing consistently in the media, it almost creates a stereotype of who should be raped, of who is going to be raped, and who is to be next. Like, if you look at this I am next, everybody in this room can assume that the person that's holding that placard is a woman. Can we position that person in the placard as a man, as a girl, as a boy? Why is it always that we position the victim as just being a woman that's over the age of 18 who was at a club and who deserves to be victim blamed? You know, why is it always the stories around you know, being in a club and being spiked, the ones that are getting more attention than the ones in, you know, arranged marriages and someone gets raped because the husband feels entitled to their sexuality? And I feel like the more we create discourses around this, the more we can actually challenge the different types of SGBV that exists within society, and also not just concentrate on one story, because it also plays within the part of the colonial systems at hand. Also, it places gender as a significant predictor of rape beliefs. Like I said, when you place one gender at the center of SGBV or GBV, it creates this illusion that only women can and should be victims of rape and sexual gender-based violence, which is not a message that I want to preach. And I think it is a message that we should definitely turn around and maybe have some discourse about. A rather interesting show that I did love is from SABC One's The Orange Couch. It basically gave any person who had, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of economical status, the opportunity to tell their story from their perspective. And what this amazing show did is that it cut the fabric of reality of how SGBV basically exists. It basically gave context to how narcissistic behavior can also be part of rape and SGBV, how economics and social economic backgrounds also play a part within SGBV, because we never actually consider stats around socio-economical statuses and all of that. And also, it also broke the barrier around poverty being the biggest thing around SGBV. Yes, statistically, women that are raped are women who are uneducated most of the time, who do not have jobs. But what I loved about this show is that it also showed women who were in positions of power, women who were CEOs, men who were in positions of power and got raped. And I think that's the conversation we should be having. SGBV cannot just be a woman-centered thing because of stats, because it will turn into a woman's problem. It will turn into a woman's fight, and never a societal fight. It will never turn into a fight where everybody is part of it. I believe as a womanist that SGBV should be a societal problem. Like the pandemic was a problem, SGBV, like you said, is not just something that occurs in one part and in one period. It is an everyday thing that everybody is a part of, is a victim of, is a survivor of, and is a perpetrator of, because we all play a part in the colonial systems that propagate and sustain SGBV within our society. Thank you.
Thank you, I think while I invite all our presenters to come to the front, I'll also just ask if there are any questions for you directly. Questions or comments just in the Q&A around topic and provocation.
Tell funny debates, but like you really called for it. So I was burning a few times. And it's on the gender question. And I say this as someone who's studying gendered and intimate partner violence of men with other men. So like I want you to hold that too. Yeah. That was my preface. But what I'm interested in obviously you've thought about this. That's why you're sharing it with us today, because the idea of degendering sexual violence and other forms of violence, noble, yes. But then, I mean, how are you making sense of our realities that show that not only do we not know much about women who are not poor, who experience gendered and sexual violence, to the point that most of the research we have is basically on the low-hanging fruit who are normally available to researchers, and most researchers go to Black poor people to ask them about their experience of sexual violence. So with that knowledge, and knowing how complex South Africa is and how inaccessible white women are to scrutiny and their purity and how they're protected by the academy and society, how do you make sense of some of the factors that I've just said in your call for us to degender what we have been talking about today as gendered and sexual violence?
It's accepting that our research as researchers, especially in academia, is very colonial. The fact that we firstly accept the fact that we can only be accessible to poor Black women within research is a problem. I mean, my research targets students who are male, specific cisgender males, because they are not prevalent within research, right? But we also have to place that challenge on ourselves as academics. Yes, they're inaccessible, but we have to try. You know, at the same time, I believe that understanding social economics does play a part as well, because not everybody is going to participate, like you said. It is quite a complex, very, very complex question, because, I mean, the white woman is the most protected person in South Africa, and her femininity is the most protected within the stories that we tell about white women within media. But it doesn't mean that they don't want to tell that story, right? It just means that we have to just, I guess, put a step forward into telling that story. I mean, I have a colleague of mine who's doing perspectives on white students within UCT, and they're seeing the existence within white privilege. That was a step that she had to take. So we as academics have the responsibility of taking the steps that are not just easy to take, but the hard ones as well. Because degenerating, decolonizing, and deracializing academia is very hard, but it needs people to step forward and do the research. I don't know if that answers your question.
We'll talk.
Thank you. Can I? Yeah, sorry, I want to engage on similar things. So I guess my concern comes in with how do we maintain, like, or do we want to, from your perspective, maintain an intersectional approach while doing what you call the degendering of this issue and deracializing? And I hear you with regard to, you know, not making it a problem of women. But at the same time, yes, but don't you find that there's maybe something troubling about having to bring other people in to victim status for it to be a societal problem? Like, men need to be victims too for us as a society to take it serious. Do you know what I mean?
I get you. Definitely. I don't think that it's positioning men or others outside of the binary as just merely as victims, but rather positioning them as part of the problem. Like, for example, I believe that patriarchy is not just propagated by men, it is a societal issue that is propagated by everybody that exists in society, right?
Yeah.
And how we fight like patriarchy is not saying that men should stop being patriarchs. It's holding them accountable to how they propagate patriarchy. But it can't just be one man telling another, stop being patriarchal. It could be you, it could be me, right? In terms of SGBD, it's positioning everybody as part of that problem. I believe as a person, as an individual, I'm not speaking of anybody else, I first see people as human and then apply the gender and social constructions of it, because, I mean, they definitely apply and they affect them in different ways. But if you look at SGBD as just a woman's problem, you're not making it a human problem. You're not positioning women as humans first who exist in society, but rather you're positioning them as just merely women. And I think that's also the problem within gender equality is that when we look at problems that face women, we only give women the responsibility of dealing with them. They never actually put it at a stage where it's a societal problem where everybody has to contribute into the solution. And I believe that when we de-gender and we de-racialize and we include everybody into that problem and in part of coming up with the solution, we're not placing the onus on merely just the person that's positioned as the victim, but we're saying everybody is responsible to come up with the solution because it affects everyone else. That's mine.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I want to move on from this to open up the conversation a bit more, but I think we also are meaning different things. You've used the term to talk about degendering. Perhaps we are talking about a range of different things that on some places we might agree and others not, but definitely I think there's a conversation to be had about how do we open up the conversation about who is violent and and about victimization and about perpetration broadly outside of something we call gender-based violence. So yeah, I mean, I think it is a broader conversation to have, but also to clarify what it is we mean by this particular thing. But I want us to kind of think about the parallels across presentations. We had some really interesting conversation about the kinds of discourses, language that is used across a range of media contexts, and how that allows us to think about victims, survivors, perpetration, who's responsible, who's not, where violence is located, where not. And we also had a really interesting perspective, a kind of behind the scenes perspective, and really appreciated your input, Carla, around like how the content that we kind of critique is produced and the perspective on it. And the questions around media practitioner, human being, being affected or not, how by the violence itself. And I guess for me, it's been as someone who's kind of been outside of that, but reading reports in a particular way, it's been really interesting to think about your what you presented in relation to just being faced with those stories. Like really, if and I wrote a paper on an voice and media representations, and I remember writing that, doing the work for that paper, and just I even have an image of myself sitting on the floor with all of the articles around me. But that period for me was quite a traumatic time. Just reading the stories and being faced with that and the trauma. And so now can't even imagine putting myself like in your position where you were interviewing people and faced in a different way. And then your conversation with us about, because my next question to you would have been like debriefing, counseling, and then you talk about like it's like a police, and so I think that brought a really interesting perspective on, like, of course, the different kinds of media. When you are working for a brand, you're interested in protecting the brand, private media, public media, and the kinds of discourses that they reproduce and draw on, and that we also that finds resonance with how we also think about violence. So yeah, with that, want to just open up. Yes, go ahead, continue.
So I find it really interesting, especially the point of no counseling, and as someone pursuing psychology, well, to become a psychologist, I think that's one of the first things that they told us, that you as a psychologist are going to need your own psychologist. You as a social worker are going to need to go see therapy. Us as ACEs under Stella, where if we feel burnt out, if we feel we can't do our gender advice in our workshops, we go see you now, we go see Stella. Like, that's when you're in the helping professions, you need help yourself. And I think an interesting implication that I would imagine that it has is that how do you expect the person reporting is to be devoid of emotions, to just state the facts, to just, what kind of discourse are they then facilitating? And I feel like that definitely has a trickle down effect to how it's presented. I can't say to my things, put in the passive voice, because it's like, as a literary device, it's just to make things more palatable and just downplay, make it a bit easier to digest, but this isn't easy to digest, especially at your level. You didn't get it easy to digest, but then you had to break it down and then give it to the public easy to digest. When this is, it's not a meal in the first place. It's not supposed to, it's not something that you should just be taking into. Okay, I just think, it's interesting why there is a push for journalists to like kind of get that kind of help, because what do you expect? Like, how do you expect the person to tell people the truth, to just accept the truth doesn't affect them when a lot of the times, I guess not in the terms of like you said the like government agencies to publish the news, not versus the federal, yes, federal broadcasting. Something like a lot, instead of that versus private media houses where it's like kind of like they want to get that shock factor. But how are you going to get a shock factor by after you told the person reporting it, take out any shock that you have? I really find that very interesting.
I just want to say around, and thank you, around access to counsel and briefing, that obviously differs across, the tiers of broadcasting news, and whether they are the resources. It also depends on the editor or the producer. All of that factors in. I don't know. I've been out of news media for about 5 years now. I don't know if it's gotten better. I seriously doubt it, because newsrooms are probably in the worst state financially in terms of resources, in terms of seniority. It's just, I cannot see them now having the resources that we didn't have when news is in this situation. It's news and media. So I imagine it's probably this.
Also, I also think I have to say, I thought one was speaking that kudos to you for leaving. You felt that you couldn't handle it. I mean, burnout is real. Yeah. And it would have affected your job, the people you're dealing with. So I think like it's a very, very noble decision. I know sometimes.
And a privilege.
Yeah, definitely.
Most fun.
Can we? I'm just checking if anyone else wants to come into the conversation.
Yeah, the social media conversation that you presented to us, Vandile. I'm just wondering, how do you perceive the way different audiences engage across various media platforms? I'm thinking about LinkedIn, where they're very professional, very politically correct, and they're very aware what to say and what not to say. They're very mindful of what will offend and what will not offend. And then when you come to your stories, on Facebook and Instagram, because they are positioned in a more private way, we once did a campaign where we posted stories, and we got quite a number of individuals reaching out to us privately through the DM, asking questions and resources. And then your Twitter, which is very political, very violent, very desensitized. Is that the case? Did you notice that? And I just want to know your take on that.
I think that's something I have been very mindful of lately, and something I think as I progressed, as a humanity student, is that you can very clearly see, and like I say this like not to put us on a pedestal, put myself on a pedestal, put academics on a pedestal, but you can see when someone is speaking on something they're informed about versus something they have an opinion on. And I think that's the biggest thing within Twitter. You're seeing people, even when things like Women for Change are posting instances that they're like, oh, here's resources. You're seeing people who don't know the definitions of different forms of sexual violence, who don't understand what victim blaming is, who don't understand the nitty-gritty of rape culture, and don't understand, how systematic and micro level patriarchy and misogyny can get, just spewing and just speaking, because they have the platform. That's the point of Twitter. Heidi, you can have a private account, even if it's you. No one's here in front of you. No one's going to hit you if you say something to them. And I think people are very comfortable with that. And I think it's very interesting, though. Also, it shifts quite a bit when it comes to private, like you said, when it's DMs, even a Twitter interaction, someone who's on the timeline and they're going back and forth in the comments, versus if you come to someone in their DM and say, hey, actually, let's engage about this. It's a completely different conversation. Now there's respect. Now there's, consideration. Now there's, oh, I'm talking to another human. And I think, I don't know if it's maybe a critique of Twitter itself as a platform of just, kind of anyone can be a keyboard warrior, as they say. Anyone can say what they want with little to no consequence. Whereas in real life, that's not the case. Like you can't just say what you want. You know, there are implications for what you say, and people in Twitter, I kind of think, relish on that fact, that it benefits them at the end of the day, and it benefits the systems which it perpetuates.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just like to just comment on Kajal's presentation. Thank you for posing the questions you did. When I read the paper that you co-authored with Prof, I wondered, where to from now? Surely there needs to be some kind of follow-up or intervention. But as a prevention educator, obviously my mind would go to designing that training manual and thinking about what kind of questions I should pose for engagement. So I really appreciated your questions, and I see them as a starting point for a conversation, particularly with the CMD staff, if an opportunity arises. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Is there no more?
There is a question online, and I'm just trying to check if the colleague can unmute. Yamna, can you unmute?
Yes,
It's a very long one.
Thanks everyone for your input. It was a wonderful session. I guess my feedback or my question is to all the panelists, not one in particular, but it's around crisis communication in particular. So often, we heard today that crisis communication often will represent the brand and the institution, but that type of email that would come through as a central email may make other staff members or students feel unsettled. They might find it vague. They might feel like not enough is being said, and they still feel like they are isolated from what's happening within our community. So my question is, are there any recommendations on how crisis communication can still represent the brand and the institution, but also give the level of transparency and reassurance that the readers need? So that being the students and the staff members. And can this type of crisis communication piece use the language or what we've heard today about, shifting the focus onto the perpetrator's actions or the investigation that the institution would have, rather than sort of, focusing on what makes a victim weak or a survivor weak. So can we take these teachings that we've learned today and can it be implemented into a communication piece where I know communication crisis communication doesn't quite do this, but is there room to be making these changes to build trust and transparency between the institution and the community, given that a lot of these instances are happening with our students or on campus like we heard today?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. I got part of a question about recommendations, I guess, for crisis communication that doesn't kind of draw on the same kind of stereotypes. That also, even the comment, I just come in because I was also struggling.
Sure. But
the comment was that often the communication that happens in crisis don't leave people feeling safe or secure. There's sometimes a desire for more information to be provided. And so the ultimate question is about recommendations for communication in times of crisis.
Yeah.
So I think firstly, that would be bad crisis communications if it is not giving people the information that they need, and it is not necessarily make people feel safe, but certainly responding to their emotions and their fears, and then so you would have instructional information, you would have adaptive information. It does then, like I said earlier, it requires a crisis communications team. So usually that would look like a specialized team within a department and the recognition from the entire department that crisis isn't just when crisis happens. So it's before that, it's preparing for it, it's assessing the situation, and it's on. So crisis is an ongoing thing. I think because of capacity, because of resources, and because of perhaps a lack of understanding of crisis, is that that doesn't happen in communications departments for many different reasons. One of the things that I had after then writing this paper was speaking to my convener and saying, we need people like you, we need crisis communication specialists to come into a communication practitioner space and actually share this information. I cannot, as a writer, be trying to convince an entire department of the need to understand crisis and how to communicate effectively. I think I'd heard you also say something about staff members and the comms that they receive. I don't know if I heard it correctly, but one of the things I had found, and it really goes across all of the crises in the past couple of years, is that the same treatment and the same care and the same communication towards the student body is not afforded to staff, especially not afforded to professional and administrative support staff. So in terms of a university, I think it's something that is an issue at every university because hierarchy is very real in the space. But that was a very big difference, is that at the time of Nene's murder and the week of mourning and the parliamentary protest, the academic calendar or schedule ongoing was called off. Our staff had to continue working. We had to continue reporting, we had to continue delivering. And so there's all of that as well. I will say that this was one of the few instances where we were actually given debriefs. So, and it will never be enough. But it was something that really stood out for me during that time, is that we had a debriefing session. And so there are things that have worked and things that we can build on, but certainly the experts need to match up with the practitioners and share the knowledge that you have. Yeah.
I'm aware that we've reached the end of time. Can you make a quick short comment?
Yes, also within the protection of the institution before being human, I think is very important. I think what I've noticed over the years since I've been in UCT is that sometimes the communication is very PR, not feeling like it's coming from a human where you're communicating with other humans.
Yeah.
I do think that the comms around me and this time was very much so, it was very humanistic and it very much so, it was unique to that situation. However, I do believe that a more humanistic approach to the students, not being clients, but more so being students who have lives, who are affected, who have, secondhand trauma of everything is definitely important. And I think that, when you position the institution as just an institution and as a business, that's where the danger starts, because it is an educational institution where there's people, social experiences are in there. It's a place where people exist. It's not just a business. And I feel like that's where the communication between students and comms sometimes, it can definitely have a disparity and a mistrust. It starts from there because whenever there's something communicated, there isn't much accountability on behalf of the institution, but rather a protection towards itself and holding others accountable. And I think this is why spaces like these are very much so important to hold the institution accountable. I really loved your analysis on holding the institution accountable because, it's good because sometimes the institution doesn't hold itself accountable and it takes very much so a business-centric PR stance in protecting itself and how to communicate from that.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, because also brought it up, and I don't think I've fleshed it out enough. So the expectation of comms people, of PR people, is that you protect the brand. That doesn't mean I agree with it. It doesn't mean that many communicators agree with that. And so there is, as there is in every space, a fight between what do we prioritize. In my view, and from the research, the most successful crisis communication is exactly the communication that you were talking about. There's a human voice, there's accountability, there's empathy, all of that. That is, and it's not just effective crisis communications, it's effective communications.
Yeah.
So always keeping the human at the center.
Thank you. And that's a good note to end off on. And I want to just in closing also say that obviously it would be interesting to look at patterns across time. So that the time that Kajal was talking about what the research she's referring to was 2016, and I'm sure that things have shifted quite a bit to now. So it's also very time, to kind of look across time how these things shift or not. And then the other point to make, I think as well, related to your wrap up, Carla, that I think that to think about this idea of what's effective, right, in terms of communication, but also what kinds of power plays and stereotypes and other kinds of discourses are we writing into? So an awareness of, so for me, victim blaming is such a long-standing thing, and to see it still prevalent in particular. So just a sensitization, or like deep sensitization about the how we write and what, like you say, passed off and the power imbalance. And so then the crisis communication and the team, the communication is aware that of those dynamics when they're communicating, aware of the stereotype, aware, of the ways of others and victims are represented. And of course, you can see here that this is an ongoing conversation, that there's a lot more to talk about. So I want to, in closing, thank all of our presenters for the really productive work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, so